Okay, I think on the first day everyone's here a little early, so I guess we can get started. So my name's Glenn Weil. You can call me Glenn, you can call me Professor Weil if you insist on it, or you can call me by any other nickname you come up with. I want you guys to view yourselves as my colleagues, not just my students, and try to come up with ideas that garner respect and not just respect the fact that I'm a professor and you're a student. So I hope you'll act that way. In particular, if I mess up on something, I hope you'll correct me or you'll jump in with ideas of your own. This is Elements of Economics, Economic Analysis 2, or ECON 2011-10. The 10 is because it's honors. And it requires a year of calculus, which we will use in the class. It's an honors section, and it's going to be honors in, and it's going to cover monopolistic and competitive and oligopolistic behavior of firms, market equilibrium and externalities, and policy applications of those ideas, in particular to regulatory, competition policy, and sort of big picture public policy issues such as redistributive taxation, intellectual property, and so forth. So the main goal of the course is to give you an idea of what it's like to be an economist. And to start to do this during the first lecture, I'll first just talk about some logistics. I'll then discuss the example of an economic analysis that I assigned to you guys to listen to. And then I'll give you an outline of the topics that we're going to cover in the course. Okay. So the course really aims to do two things. The first is to give a flavor of what it's like to be an economist. What sorts of questions do economists think about? What are the policy questions that someone like me is asked to advise, say, someone in the government or in a firm on? And these examples will be drawn from my own experience of policy work, as well as from issues that my colleagues have worked on that I have found particularly interesting. And I'm going to try to ask you not just to follow my ideas about these, but to some extent to reach your own conclusions about them. And in particular, I'm going to try to get you to think about how economists will look at these issues distinctively from how someone else trained in another field or not trained academically might think about them. In particular, I'd like by the end of the course for you to have almost a bit of a stereotype sense of what an economist would say about an issue. What would be a distinctively economic way to talk about a public policy issue as opposed to the perspective that you would expect from a non-economist. And third, I want you to be able to think about how you can use economics to solve social problems. In case you ever work for the government, you will be someone who had a degree in economics as an undergraduate. And someone may come to you and say, oh, you studied economics. What would an economist say about this? How would you approach this problem as an economist? And I'd like you to be able to give a coherent answer to that, hopefully partly coming out of this class. Or if you ever work in the private sector, and you're trying to understand the social implications of some activity that you're engaging in. You want to know whether an activity that, a project that you're working on is actually going to improve social welfare, or why, or how you would justify that. My hope is that based on this class and other classes you take, you'll be able to give some coherent explanation. Now, I also need to teach you some of the tools that are necessary to be an economist. That's less the emphasis of this course than it is of perhaps the last course you took, the 210 course. A bit of work on developing your mathematical and empirical techniques for addressing these questions, but there will be more of an emphasis on the big picture thinking about how an economist approaches a problem. Okay. So relative to previous economics courses that you've taken at Chicago, this course will be different in a few respects. So one is that I will start cold calling starting today. Those are based on random assignments of people, and it will annoy the hell out of you to begin with. but I think eventually you'll find that it's a good mechanism for keeping it from being only the smarty pants that talk during class, and keeping you having to do the reading before class so that you're up to date and engaged with the material. And I also want to understand at what point people are at currently in understanding the material so that I'm constantly getting the right feedback to pitch the course in the right way. Okay, so please do your reading before class. Second, the course will try to not just teach you mathematical material in class and then give you problems that test that mathematical material. Instead, we'll try to do substantive, interesting material in economics in the class. The TA sessions will reinforce some of the skills associated with those. And then on problem sets, you will actually be asked to master yourself some of the material. And to actually learn new concepts through the problems that you do, rather than simply regurgitating something that you learned in class. Now, the problem sets are also, I think, going to be a bit more open-ended and maybe a bit harder than some of the problem sets that you've done in other economics classes. And they're going to count for a larger part of your grade than they may have counted for in previous economics classes. And in particular, I'll talk a little bit more about the structure of these problem sets in a minute, but there'll really be more of an emphasis of this class perhaps than others. Now, scores in the class are likely to be lower than you're used to getting in other economics classes, though perhaps not too much lower. In the first year that I taught, they were very, very low. But they're going to be very generously curved, and the grade distribution in this class will be at least as generous as in ones that you've had, even if the initial scores you get will be lower, so just be calibrated to that. Don't freak out. I want you to come to office hours. I want to engage with you. I want to get to know each of you. Hopefully by the end of the class I'll know all your names and I'll know something about each of your interests. So please do come to office hours of both me and the TAs, to the sections and so forth. This is a class where I really want you guys to be engaged with both the class and the material. Okay. So the course website's on Chalk. There's also more information about teaching on my website. The required readings and additional references are in the syllabus, but I also have an extended list of readings if you guys are interested in digging in deeper that I'd be happy to send to you. The text for the class is Intermediate Microeconomics by Hal Varian. I will assign some readings from this, but I think you should view it more as a reference than as the core of the material I'm going to be teaching. The core of the material I'm teaching is very idiosyncratic to me, and it is in particular on sort of the cutting edge of what people are doing in economics, and there isn't necessarily a text that perfectly captures it, though Varian is a good fallback for the foundational material that you'll have to be learning. All other readings will be on the website and available to you that way. Some references, though none of the actual readings, will be on reserve at the library. You can reach me at my email address or by calling my office at the number provided. And my office hours are Wednesday from 4 to 6 in Rosenwald 205B, which is my office. That will start tomorrow. But as we'll discuss in a moment, we're going to have a movie tomorrow. So I'm going to leave office hours with everyone who's there about 15 minutes early to go and set up the movie, and in particular set up the food that accompanies the movie. The section leader is Chen, who is in the back of the class there. This is his email address. His section is from 6 to 7 on Thursdays in this room. And he has office hours from 3 to 4:30 on Thursdays in Stewart Cafe, which is basically right after this class. He will mostly cover math and problem sets, but he will also deal with some of the concepts related to the course. Okay. So there are going to be 6 problem sets during the term, which will in aggregate constitute 40% of your grade. There will be a midterm that will be 20% of your grade and a final that will be 30% of your grade. The midterm will be in class on Thursday, November 1st. You have to let me know immediately if you cannot make that. The final will be scheduled by the administration and will be 3 hours long. Exams are all open everything, but no two-way communication. So we will monitor your computers to make sure you're not sending messages back and forth to one another, but other than that, you should feel free to use anything that you want to aid you on the exam, the internet, the problem sets, etc. And please do bring a calculator in Mathematica. I have no interest in testing your ability to do math by hand. I'm only interested in your grasp of economic concepts, okay? All problem sets will be due at the beginning of the lecture, at which it says that that problem set is due. All the problem sets are already up on Chalk, and the first will be due a week from Thursday. No extensions are going to be granted on any of the problem sets, so make sure you get those in on time. Problem sets will, yeah.
On the syllabus it says that...
What's your name, by the way?
Mateus.
Mateus.
The syllabus it says that the midterm is on November 5th.
Is that right? That's almost certainly correct. And this year is just later than last year, and I forgot to update this. It's whenever it says it is on the syllabus. That's the day that's right after, like, the regulation lecture or something like that, right? Is that what it says on the syllabus? Does it look like it's correctly numbered there? Okay, good. Yeah. So
because November 1st is also a Friday, so...
November 1st, yeah. So this is definitely from last year when things were a little bit earlier. So yes, Thursday, November 5th. Sorry about that. Now, you're not expected to complete everything on the problem sets. Be aware of that. Everything will be curved. 10% of the class grade will be participation. And we really do want you to participate, so I will cold call during lecture. And there will also be attendance taken at section. And participation in section will also be at Chen's discretion, part of your participation grade. Yeah, go ahead.
Since you say you don't expect us to actually complete the entire problem set, as a general guide, what should we be doing?
I think that the average that people get on the problem sets is about 60 to 70%. I think someone who's doing exceptionally well is getting 80% of the points. So what I mean by that is you could try to complete everything, but it's more important that you get a bunch of stuff right than that you complete everything. Right. And you can do very well without completing everything. So focus on the things where you really feel you have an understanding of the material, and you can focus on things that maybe are your comparative advantage rather than just doing everything blindly. Okay, and that's particularly true on the exams. Okay, you have to tell me if you're not going to come to things. Okay, so 2 years ago, this again I forgot to change from last year's slides. 2 years ago I taught this class. It was extremely hard. I don't know if it still has the reputation that it had last year, but it demanded quite a bit of creativity of students. I think last year it was less hard than it was 2 years ago, and also the students were more these honors students like you guys who were more up to it. I want to try to maintain this difficulty and engagement and richness, but I want to try, like last year, to make it a little bit more manageable for people. As a result, I'm going to structure evaluations in the following way. So the problem sets will build off old problem sets from either the first year or either of the 2 years of the more advanced version of this class, which is 24210. And you will be able to find some very useful information about the answers of almost all problems you'll be assigned in either the relevant problem sets from 24210 or from the ECON 20100 classes that I taught the first year. All that stuff, all the solutions, etc., are available on Chalk. So do dig into Chalk, look at the solutions, look at the relevant problems, look for things that might be related. I sort of want you to research by looking into how those problems were solved, and rather than having to generate the answers to those types of problems yourself, I want you to sort of learn how they were solved and then draw something out of that for the solutions to the problem sets. So that's part of this learning by doing that I want you to do as you do the problem sets. Okay. Exams will be even more on that model. So all the questions on the exams are going to be based on problems from the problem sets in a pretty direct way, but with some sort of modification to make them not completely trivial. But if you've mastered the solutions to the problem sets, you should be pretty well able to master the solutions to the exams. Okay, so it's going to be a very challenging class. That's how it's meant to be. But I hope it will also be manageable and hopefully fun for you guys. And to start making it fun, we're going to have a movie tomorrow night at 6:30 in Social Science 122. And there will be food provided. It will be from the Fat Shallot. I don't know if you guys have ever had that, but it's my favorite food truck. The food truck will pull up outside of Social Sciences on 59th Street at about 5:45 or so. There will be a class list given to them. Every student can choose one sandwich, one side if they want, and one drink. They make everything fresh on board, so it may take a while and there may get to be a line. If so, try to stay in the movie while you're waiting for your food to come up as much as possible, and then just go out to get it. And hopefully everyone will get served in a reasonable amount of time. But please do come to the movie. It is required for the class, and we will use it in the class. If you can't come to the movie, find it on your own, and we'll and hopefully you'll get it that way. Okay. So I want to launch the class by showing you sort of the power of economic analysis by an example of something that I recently heard on the radio. So I was listening to the radio and this story came on, and it almost made me cry, because to me this was like a perfect example of what it feels like to see the beauty of economic analysis at work. So I think what economists get aesthetic pleasure out of is seeing some mechanism that is really crucially at play in the world, and yet is never the way that the people involved in the problem think about what's going on, or the way that you would casually come to think about it, because it really reveals, an invisible hand of how things work in a way that might be hidden from initial observation. And I thought that this was a really beautiful and sort of striking example of that. So I wanted you guys to look at that. Okay. So it takes a natural dichotomy that we're used to from the movies, cops versus robbers, basically, and it looks at it from an economic perspective and makes a very persuasive argument that actually these people who appear to be enemies of each other are actually each other's best friends. And it does this by skillfully using a number of the ideas that we're going to learn throughout the course. Okay, so Austin?
That's me?
Yeah, Austin. What's the basic argument of this report?
Well, it's been a while, but I seem to remember that the drug dealers were moving from California, where drug laws basically they don't care about marijuana dealing, to New York, where it's much more illegal with just additional returns.
Yep.
And I suppose, in some sense, from an economic perspective, the reason for that is just because it's illegal, you can earn excess returns, like as a compensating differential for having to put up with cops.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a specific additional detail that I think is quite important to what's going on, but you captured the basic spirit of it. So the key point that it was making is that there's some marijuana dealers who are particularly good at dealing in illegal markets. They've figured out a way, either through violence in some cases, or in this guy's case, because he was just really good at establishing personal relationships that are necessary to sell an illegal good like this, that makes them very good at operating in illegal markets. When legal competitors come in and drive down the price, it's very, very hard for those people to compete. And without these types of illegal vendors who are skilled, there's also no role for the police to stop them from doing this sort of stuff. As a result, legalization of marijuana redistributes both from the police and from the illegal dealers to people who are good at operating large-scale legal marijuana manufacturing facilities. And so this means that actually the police and the and the drug dealers, who might seem superficially to be enemies, both really need each other in order to live. Okay, so how does the piece make this argument? Well, first, it says that legalizing hurts people who are particularly good at selling things illegally. And is Rishi here?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you explain how that works? Why that would be the case?
When marijuana became legal in California, a lot of marijuana farmers came into California, and the glut of marijuana farming drove down the prices considerably.
Yeah.
So the dealer that was in marijuana started facing a price for marijuana which was much lower than he was expected to, much lower than what he could get in New York.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's right. And in particular, the people who are adapted to selling it illegally are not exceptionally good at producing large quantities. What they're good at doing is producing a small quantity and avoiding being captured. So the sort of things that are demanded when it now becomes legal are not demanded when it was illegal, are not demanded any longer when it becomes legal. Second, it argued, is Philip here?
Yes.
Philip, yeah. Could you discuss why legalizing in California might actually reduce the price or increase the availability of marijuana in New York? It discussed two reasons why that would be the case.
Well, the first reason is dealers like the one that discussed in the article are able to move their operation to New York because the New York environment is more favorable to them.
Yeah. Don't look at the slides. You're not allowed to look at the slides.
I'm actually looking back at the article.
No, you're not. Yeah, go on. Yeah, what's the other reason? Can you think of it?
The second is that marijuana can be produced legally in California and then smuggled over to New York, making it easier for legal dealers to procure the supply.
That's right. That's right. Okay, and third, the author argues, or the piece argues, that illegal markets raise the market power of someone who is able to form a strong personal brand and set of personal relationships. And Philip, why would that be the case?
Because dealing illegally does not allow you to have recourse to the courts in case one party scams somehow. So you need to personally trust the person because trust is the only assurance that he's not selling you fake marijuana or otherwise cheating you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you also might be afraid of getting in legal trouble yourself, and you need to trust that the person isn't going to somehow betray you or fail to take the right precaution in order to make sure that you don't get caught. Okay. So fourth, the piece argues that the invisible hand guides the individuals in ways that they don't themselves see. And Evan, you're Evan, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What? How does the article make that point?
Are you referring to how it was just talking about the interplays of force that they may not realize,
Yeah.
supplier is...
What's the difference between how they think about themselves and their role and the way that actually the market is causing them to interact with each other?
Well, when the pot dealer was talking about his own experiences, he talked about really on an interpersonal level about how he's making relationships, about how people just wanting to get pot. But really what's happening here is you have this larger information asymmetry problem where people don't want to get screwed. They want to make sure that they're in a safe place, and that really helps him.
Yeah, so he had this whole ideology of being sort of personally friendly with people, being your neighborhood pot dealer, being, sort of a hipster was sort of the feeling that you got from him, right? But all of that was serving a social role of addressing the problems that Philip was raising, right? Similarly, the pot dealer thought of himself as being, very good at dodging the police, very careful about where he did his deals and so forth. And the policeman thought of himself as stopping the great tide of marijuana from, coming and harming people in the country. But in reality, these guys who sort of viewed themselves as opposite were actually each serving each other's interests. The illegal marijuana dealer was giving the cop a job to try to catch people like him, and the cop was suppressing the competition for the illegal marijuana dealer and therefore raising his ability to earn his livelihood, right? So I thought what was really cool about this was the way in which people's self-conception of their own role was so different from the role that they actually were serving within the economic, machine. And see, this is what I think is so beautiful about economics. Each one of us goes through life, and we have certain views about why we're doing things, or what role we serve, or what we're supposed to be doing. And those are perfectly reasonable ways to go about living our life. But if you step back and you look at it from above and you look at the machine, you'll realize that maybe you believe that for the following reason. And that you actually believe that and think that you do that and do these things every day because that serves the following goal. And if social conditions change, it may be that the beliefs that you have to have will change along with those social conditions. But you wouldn't know that unless you took this broader perspective of looking at how the economic forces shape not just what people do, but the way in which people conceptualize themselves. And I thought that this piece really showed that in a sort of beautiful way. Okay. So, Andrew, can you tell me what some of the lessons for public policy coming out of this piece might have been?
So maybe the piecemeal legalization of marijuana isn't the way to go. So you legalize it in California, and you heard a state like New York has a policy against that. So
Yeah, that's one really good point.
National policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So there can be big spillovers between states, so maybe it shouldn't really be the right of the state to just legalize on its own. The federal government chooses whether marijuana is legal or not and tries to enforce against states like California. And people have said, well, why doesn't California have the right to legalize? Well, there may be very important spillovers from one state to another. Another one that I thought was really interesting is that one of the most important constituencies opposed to legalization may actually be criminals. So I actually have some friends who I know who are involved in the illegal marijuana business in California, and nobody was more strongly opposed to marijuana legalization in California than these guys were. I mean, they were out there doing everything they can to sign up with, Mothers Against, pot smoking, because they didn't want the competition from the legal marijuana dealers. And another really interesting implication of that is that actually the government might actually be very allied or even friendly with illegal suppliers of marijuana. Why? Because their main goal is to try to keep other people out of the market. If you're friends with the guy who's in charge of the illegal marijuana supply, he cares about getting marijuana to market, but even more he cares about keeping other people out of the market, which is the same goal that the government has because it wants to raise the price. So actually there might be quite a tight alignment of interest between a government trying to reduce the consumption of marijuana and an illegal supplier who's trying to maintain a monopoly over marijuana. All of those things, I think, are not things you would initially think about had you not taken this alternative economic way of looking at the problem. Okay. So the article also raised a number of issues that will come up throughout the class and that we'll talk about and will be sort of the core economic principles that you'll be applying to many different problems. So for example, it discussed how ideology or self-conception can act as a form of motivation or commitment or otherwise give incentives to individuals in a situation. So here, this notion of me being the friendly neighborhood marijuana dealer, loving my clients, etc., was a way of him committing to be honest with his clients, which helped solve the asymmetric information problem. And we'll see quite a bit of that actually in the Margin Call movie that you'll see tomorrow night. A second issue is the importance of heterogeneity across individuals and ability, right? This guy only lost from the legalization of marijuana because he was particularly good at operating in an illegal market. Other people who were not good at operating in an illegal market probably gained, or at least didn't lose, from this legalization. A third principle is comparative advantage. That there were things that this guy was particularly good at, that he specialized in, and other people who were good at other things, like catching him or like producing legal goods, maybe specialized in other areas. And these sort of list the lectures in which we'll be talking about these concepts. Another idea that we'll be talking about is the fact that firms with market power have an interest in reducing the quantity of a good that's supplied to the market. So the marijuana dealer who sort of had a little bit of a monopoly on marijuana really didn't want there to be more marijuana in the market, right? He wanted to keep that down in order to keep up his price. Another issue that we'll talk about is the way in which asymmetric information can cause markets to collapse, and therefore it's very important to solve those asymmetric information problems. Another thing that we'll talk, we actually won't, sorry, this ended up being, we had to scratch this lecture, so I'll just drop that. Okay, and I think there's lots of other examples if you listen carefully to the piece of economic concepts that guide the analysis. So I think that this piece had some very exciting, very powerful, very engaging, interesting analysis, but is it really science? I mean, this was just some report that some guy gave, where he gave his interpretation of what was going on. Is that really science? I mean, there was no experiment that he ran. There wasn't really very clear predictions that he was making that were being falsified or not, right? Now, the view you learned of science in middle school was probably that, science is all about hypothesis, test, generate a new hypothesis, test, etc. But it's not clear that this is true even in the hardest of hard sciences. Consider Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Essentially, Darwin's theory of evolution has never made a falsifiable prediction, right? It's all about explaining why certain things exist. So a typical, thing that's Darwin's theory that's used as evidence for Darwin's theory is that, the leopard has spots that allow him to blend in with his environment. So he must have adapted those spots in order to avoid, his prey detecting him or something like that, right? But of course, that's a story. It's a nice story that helps you interpret what's going on. But it's just a story, right? It's not like there was some prediction, some experiment run, and then some test of that. And yet Darwin's theory of evolution is one of the most important scientific theories that all of us learn and should learn in schools. And in fact, even many things in physics, if you really think about them, were more explanations than they really were experiments that were falsified. So the typical analysis runs something like Friedman, like the NPR piece that you guys listened to, where, you have some fact, like in the case of evolution, camouflage. Like, why does this particular animal have this particular camouflage? Well, it helps them fit in with the environment. Similarly, in this piece, you might say, well, why does this guy have these views about, being so friendly with his clients, being the neighborhood guy that everybody knows and loves, and so forth? Well, it helps to solve this asymmetric information problem. Those types of arguments are very similar. You use some sort of canonical concept from the theory to explain or make sense of some observed regularity. And then, based on that prescription, you may be able to explanation, you may be able to prescribe some policy outcome or behavior that you think would be good given that story. So in the example of evolution, it's often used to say that we shouldn't have as much use of antibiotics because the organisms will adapt to those antibiotics and become more virulent, right? And similarly here, we use that story that we had to say that maybe you shouldn't have piecemeal marijuana legalization, or maybe you should have collaboration between the state and the marijuana dealers. Okay. In fact, even the hardest theories in science, the ones that people are, most sure are falsifiable and have content, do not make predictions on their own. So if you think about Newton's laws of gravitation, those seem like the clearest scientific theories. But any time you've ever taken a physics class and used them to make a prediction, you make 1,000 other assumptions about the way that the world actually works, which are not only needed in addition to the theory, but also are totally wrong. So you assume that the Earth is a vacuum, right? And that anything that falls towards the Earth falls through a vacuum, which is clearly not true, right? You assume that there's no air resistance, which is not true. You assume that the object has a very particular shape, which is almost certainly not the shape that the object actually has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in economics, we have to do that too. The power of the theory comes not from its assumptions being exactly correct, but some very coarse assumptions which seem to capture some essence of what's going on, but not all the details, is nonetheless, in a simple way, able to give you a very clear understanding of some fact that you observe in the world. And so in some sense, rather than thinking of sciences just as falsifiable predictions, in some sense what a science is, it's a language for talking about things. Newton's theory of gravity gets you to talk about the masses of things and their height above the ground or their distance from each other. It focuses on those aspects and not on lots of other details because it sees those as essential and is able to get some sharp understanding of things out of thinking about things in those terms. And similarly, economics is going to get you to talk in terms of monopolies, asymmetric information, incentives, aggregating information, etc. And once you learn to talk in those terms, there will be just things that are easy to express that weren't easy to express without the language of economics. Okay. So in particular, the core of the language of economics is the rationality postulate. And to make an analogy between this and evolution, in evolution we usually talk about, here's the environment. There's these trees around and whatever, and the leopard wants to fit into those trees. And that's why he has the spots, right? It's very much a sort of teleological, someone is trying to do something given some environment, right? And it's all based on adapting, given particular limited resources and a fixed environment, to be as adaptive as you can possibly be. And economics has a very similar structure to evolution in this way in terms of how it makes arguments. It has a few basic elements. People have utility or preferences, which correspond in evolution to capacity to reproduce. And they have constraints, which correspond in evolution to the environment in which you need to fit into, right? And economists assume that preferences, like evolution just takes preferences as being reproduction, economists assume that preferences are pretty much given to you by something outside of economics as a field itself. They come from basic ideas from psychology, sociology, or biology, but not internal to economics. And then economics tends to interpret all constraints as some notion of a price or a trade-off that you need to make between different things. And those prices, in turn, are determined by markets, by the technology that's available, and by the information that different individuals have. And this is where the laws of science interact, of hard science interact heavily with economics, because they determine the information that's available to people. They determine the technology that they can use for production. And they determine the capacity of things to be structured around different types of markets. Now, economics, particularly the types of economics that we're going to focus on today in this class, price theory, focuses on the behavior of large numbers of individuals in the aggregate. We'll think about individual behavior, we'll think about people's incentives, but it will all be just an input into thinking about the aggregate behaviors of large numbers of individuals who interact through markets with each other. Now, I don't think that this is the only approach to studying human behavior. In fact, even within economics, game theory thinks a lot more about the interactions between individuals. Sociology thinks much less about the desires of a particular individual and instead about the nature of those constraints and the way in which social structures shape people, and so forth. But I hope that you will find economics can be a useful discipline on your thinking, provides a fruitful language to analyze many problems, not just within economics, but in many different areas of human life, and that it's applicable to a broad range of settings, not only traditional economic settings. Okay. So, to give you some examples of the types of questions that you're going to learn to use economics to answer, one of them will be, does ideology have a useful role in public policy? When might collusion between firms actually be beneficial to society and harmful? What are the distributive effects of price discrimination? Does it benefit, does it help the rich take from the poor or actually give to the poor from the rich? When does it make sense to have special tax breaks? You know, the things that you always hear the politicians screaming about how terrible they are, that there's some tax loophole or tax break for some specific group and we should have a simple tax system. Well, when might it make sense to give such a specific tax break? How progressive should the tax system be? How much higher rates should the rich have to pay than the poor do? What does equality of opportunity mean? And how can we think about the trade-offs involved in equality of opportunity? We all know that equality of outcomes might reduce your incentive to work, but what's the trade-off with equality of opportunity? How should illegal drug markets be regulated? What's the right mix of direct government support for research and development and intellectual property? Those are alternative ways of encouraging research. Which one is better under what circumstances? Under what circumstances should a merger between two companies be approved by the government? And under what circumstances should it be prohibited? When is eminent domain? That's when the government comes in and steals, land from a bunch of people in order to build a public project. When is that necessary? When is it desirable? And might there be better ways to make it work? When is voting a good way to make a decision as a group of people? Or what might be alternatives? So in order to be able to answer these questions, you'll have to master tools from a broad range of economics. These are a huge range of different public policy questions that I hope that after this class you'll have something very interesting, unusual, and different than what a non-economist could say about these questions. And to do that, you're going to have to learn about a bunch of areas. So today, we talked about just an example of that sort of analysis. But on Thursday, we're going to be talking about the theory of the firm. In particular, what a corporation is, what's its legal basis, how can we think of companies as behaving, how do they act, what should companies try to achieve, and how do internal conflicts within companies stop them from maximizing profit or achieving their desired goals? How does the financial structure of a firm affect how they're able to do this? And how should the firm choose its financial structure in order to accomplish its goals? What activities should occur within a company and what activities should a company outsource to other companies? Okay. Then next Tuesday, we're going to talk about costs. And in that lecture, we'll discuss how we mathematically describe firms' production technologies, how we graphically represent production technologies and costs, how we classify costs into different categories of fixed, variable, and sunk costs, how cost curves relate to one another, and what assumptions we typically make about cost curves, as well as how we measure them. Okay. Then we're going to turn to talking about supply by an individual firm and how that relates to the duration of time over which that supply takes place. We'll talk about how much a competitive firm will supply and how that relates to their cost function. We'll talk about how firms respond both to temporary changes and to changes that last a longer time in their demand, and how those two responses are related to one another. We'll also talk about investment that firms make and how that relates to how long they expect to be producing the thing that they're making the investment in order to produce. Okay. Then we'll talk about the supply by a whole industry, not just an individual firm. And we'll relate that to the supply of the individual firms. We'll decompose supply into the entry of new firms and the expansion of existing firms. We'll talk about the circumstances under which a competitive firm can nonetheless make profits, and the role of exceptional technology or talent in producing those profits. That will lead us into a discussion of the empirical regularities about the distribution of firm size and the distribution of talent. Then we'll put that industry together with what you learned about consumer behavior in order to talk about a competitive equilibrium. And we'll start with some simple graphical representations of general equilibrium. And then we'll talk about some applications. So why does international trade promote efficiency? How efficient is the price system and why is it efficient? When does the price system outperform other alternatives to it, like socialism? Then we'll talk about externalities, and in particular the principle of payments in accordance with product. And alternative ways of implementing the notion of everyone having to pay in accordance with the product, including cap and trade, Pigouvian taxes, and damages through the legal system. We'll talk about Coase's theorem and the issue of getting the right information in order to internalize externalities. And that will lead us into the next lecture, which will be all about figuring out the information necessary in order to internalize externalities. We'll talk both about doing objective calculations, and that will lead us into the notion of cost-benefit analysis and the techniques that are used to do that, in particular the scientific techniques that enter into that. But then we'll also talk about ways of, in that context, evaluating the benefit that comes to any given individual from something based on various notions of market prices. And as an example of that, we'll use the statistical value of a human life. How much is a human life worth to someone to preserve? And we'll apply that to the evaluation of the externalities created by the pollution of carbon into the atmosphere causing global warming. We'll then talk about ways to elicit from individuals, to get out of individuals, information that is not available in market prices and that only individuals themselves may know. One method will be taking surveys that are called contingent valuation surveys, but we'll see that there's some major problems with those types of surveys, and we'll talk about some of the alternatives to those. Then we're going to move beyond perfect competition to thinking about monopoly. So we'll talk about how monopolies maximize profits, the relationship between optimal monopoly pricing and the elasticity of demand. the dead weight loss that monopoly causes both in theory and in data. We'll talk about how taxes are passed through by a monopoly. You learned probably about the incidence of taxation under competition. We'll talk about the incidence of taxation under monopoly. Then we'll talk about how monopoly can be dealt with, the problems created by monopoly can be dealt with through regulation. We'll talk about natural monopolies and the difference between regulating them to charge marginal cost versus average cost. And we'll talk about some of the informational problems that arise in trying to implement efficient regulation that make some of these schemes more difficult. We'll then talk about monopolistic competition and the notion that a market might behave like an average cost monopolist because firms can freely enter, and if there are any profits, firms will enter until average cost is being charged. And that will lead us into a discussion of selection markets and their regulation, in particular markets like insurance or other cases where there's asymmetric information, where firms will try to attract consumers that have the greatest value to them, and depending on the value of consumers, the cost of the firm will be different. Then we'll turn beyond just simple monopoly that just charges a single price to monopolists that are attempting to price discriminate. We'll talk about third-degree price discrimination, and we'll apply that to medications that are charged different prices in foreign countries than they are in the US. We'll talk about second-degree price discrimination, which is where you, rather than charging explicitly different prices to different people, you have some range of different products or prices for different quantities, and you allow the people who just naturally want a higher quality product, who have greater willingness to pay, to buy those and to pay a higher price for them. And then we'll talk about a number of applications of price discrimination. Then we're going to turn to intellectual property, which I think is an interesting policy question related to monopoly. And in particular, we'll talk about the role that monopoly profits play as an incentive for people to create new innovations. And we'll relate that to the economics of crime and to the role of dynamics of new products being created in competition. We'll talk about intellectual property as a policy tool in that area, and about optimal intellectual property policy, as well as alternatives to traditional intellectual property as ways of incentivizing innovation. Next, we're going to turn to redistribution, and we'll talk about trends in global inequality. The veil of ignorance argument for why we might want to reduce inequality, which you might associate with Rawls. And that will motivate the notion of evaluating the distribution of wealth according to utilitarian criteria. I'll give you a refresher on the notion of risk aversion and concave utility as a way to motivate why it might be more valuable for the poor to have resources than for the rich. And we'll use that to derive some principles about how progressive taxation should be, and to empirically calibrate that using some information on income distributions in the US and on how responsive people are to increased taxes in terms of reducing how hard they work. So next, I'm going to turn to talking about imperfect competition. So we will have talked about monopoly and perfect competition, but then I'm going to turn to imperfect competition. So first we'll talk about oligopoly, how firms in an oligopoly behave, Cournot's formal mathematical model of oligopoly, the critique of that model by Edgeworth and Bertrand, the Stackelberg model of oligopoly, and broader ideas based on conjectural variations about how to put these different models together in a unified framework. And in particular, we'll be interested in Stigler's model of oligopoly, which relates it to the degree to which firms are able to collude or coordinate their behavior with one another. Next, we'll talk about competition policy, which is one of the leading tools to try to deal with oligopoly. We'll talk about how competition can help reduce prices and make markets more efficient. Many of the effects of increased competition, how competition can lead to perfect competition when there's a large number of firms. And we'll apply those ideas to the review of mergers, which is a really central tool of competition policy around the world. Finally, in the last few days of class, we're going to talk about public goods. And we'll start that by talking about, rather than competition, something that's sort of the opposite of competition, which is when there's many monopolists who each produce parts of a given product. And that will reduce the efficiency rather than increasing efficiency. And that will be related to the problem of public goods, where everybody needs to make contributions into having a public good work well. We'll talk about the way in which unanimity could or could not be a potential solution to the problem of public goods, and we'll relate that actually to the idea behind Groupon. And then we'll talk about some of the problems that that mechanism has, and the need for collective government coercive action in order to organize public goods. Now, collective government action requires some mechanism for us all to make a decision about what the government should do. And voting is the most traditional way to do that. But I'll talk about a lot of problems that the majority rule has, in particular the fact that it fails to incorporate how strongly people feel about an issue. A classic example of that is the gay marriage issue, right? There's about 4% of the population who cares a tremendous amount about what happens with gay marriage, and 96% of the population that hardly cares at all, right? I mean, they might feel a little bit one way or a little bit the other, but they don't really care very much. And it's kind of crazy in that sort of circumstance to take a majority vote on what the issue should, on which way the issue should go. You should obviously be weighting a lot more the preferences of the people who are directly affected than of other people. And we'll talk about a mechanism that I've proposed called quadratic voting, that's an economic-based alternative that allows you to incorporate how strongly people feel about issues. And we'll talk about the price theoretic logic behind it, as well as practical applications of quadratic voting, and we'll wrap up the course. So that's what you guys can look forward to. I'm going to end a little bit early today so that I can take any questions you have about the course. But you can always also obviously come to office hours tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to spending this quarter with you. Yeah, Philip.
At what time will we have typically learned the material that we are expected to apply to a given problem set?
The problem set will include material basically evenly distributed over all the lectures that were after the previous problem set and before this one is due. So that includes the material that you will learn just 2 days before the problem set if it's due on a Thursday, or just a weekend before the problem set if it's due on a Tuesday. But that will only be usually a small fraction of the material because there will be, say, 3 or 4 lectures leading up to it. So we'll incorporate, maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of it will be the most recent material. Yeah.
What's your policy on collaboration on problem sets?
Extremely encouraged. Please list your name, the names of all the people you collaborated with. But yes, we're very much in favor of that. Yeah.
Not so much a question about logistics, but the thing you said about technology.
Can you guys, but until I learn your names, can you just tell me your names when you ask questions? Yeah, what's your name?
Abhinav.
Abhinav, okay.
Yeah, so I think this is not a question about logistics, but
Yeah.
you talked about technology
Yeah.
and in relation to the constraints on market.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how the laws of hard science
Yeah.
enter into that or are analogous.
Mhm.
Could you explain exactly what you meant?
Well, so what I meant is that, okay, so for example, when we talk about cost-benefit analysis, we're going to be talking about how when I emit carbon, that causes the temperature to go up, that reduces the ability of somebody else to produce corn somewhere in the world, right? Or maybe increases somebody else's ability. So that's the technology, right? Or that's what economists would call technology. It says, if I do this, it has these consequences for other people's ability to produce. And all that stuff is derived from scientific thinking. Another example that's like that is I have a friend who's recently been working on spectrum auctions. And the key issue in spectrum auctions is how does my use of spectrum, one part of the electromagnetic spectrum, say to do Wi-Fi, interfere or not interfere with your ability to listen to the radio, right? And the interactions between all of those things are really key and come out of science, not from economics. So those constraints, those technologies that we work with are derived from other fields of hard science, just as our preferences are often derived from biology, sociology, and psychology.
Right, so the link is more kind of literal in that the laws of hard science dictate kind of how computers can be made to give us more information, or
Exactly. In information, we rely on computers, and as computers change, as our ability to communicate changes, the information structures that are relevant change. As our physical production capacity changes, the interactions between different individuals' production changes. Yeah, most of the words I'm going to try to use will be in their most literal possible meaning. So I actually mean, when I say information, I mean information. When I say technology, I mean like that, science tells us about what technologies are possible, right? So yeah.